Sit. Good morning. Good morning.
Morning, Dave.
Morning.
Morning, Dave.
Good morning.
Morning, Dave.
Good morning.
Hi, morning.
Welcome. Not a bad day to do a bit of yoga inside. But why there was a waiting room this morning, I didn't remember setting that up. So I just have to admit people in. So you might want to have your notebook handy, because I'm going to be talking for a little while at first. Good morning. Oh, I'm getting blind. Good morning. I just mentioned there, those who are just joining, if you want to grab your notebook, I'm going to be talking just for a little while. Good morning, welcome. Just admitting a few folks in. If you just arrived, just grab your notebook. I'll be talking for a little while. If you haven't already, if you could put your camera on, please. Or your screen on, whatever it is. Okay, some of you still don't have your camera on. If you pop it on, please. Okay, so we'll start. You're very welcome on this wet Saturday morning. Let's have a look at my camera setup. Okay. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read what's on here. It's mainly for me, but you can. I'll talk you through it. You can take it down as we go. So, thanks for being here. I know being middle of the summer, might be other places you'd rather be, but at least it doesn't look like a beach day today, so being indoors might not be too bad. I thought what we could do, rather than, this format is not ideal, obviously, for myself or for you as a student. Many things might get lost in this screen to translation. So I'm just trying to keep it as simple as possible. Not bring in too many new things, but also challenge you at the same time. Sorry, just got to admit somebody else in. Morning. So, I've just started, so don't worry. So I thought what I'd do is do some review on what's been covered so far, and put it in the context of the system of Hatha Yoga. In my experience through the Ashtanga system, the Iyengar system, and the Shadow system, there's obviously going to be differences between each, but there's also more similarities than there are differences. Certainly in terms of how certain practices are laid out, what needs to be done or understood or integrated before something else happens, and so on. There'll be different interpretations of that, but the general outlay is pretty much similar. So I wanted to go over the different aspects that make up, from the point of view of some of the Hatha Yoga texts that I've read over the years and the systems I've studied, the main components of a effective Hatha Yoga practice. Yeah. Now there are many other aspects that I could get into as well, the likes of diet and activities off the mat, if you like. So I'm not necessarily going to be talking about philosophical practices or the likes of the yamas and the niyamas, but more the components of a physical Hatha Yoga practice within, let's say, this next 2 hours. If that makes sense, okay? In terms of my interpretation. So the obvious one at the top here would be the asana, the posture practice. Everyone knows that. And you might even say, unfortunately, the majority of people equate yoga to some kind of physical practice, and that's it. Yeah. To the point where it might even be, sorry, another one coming in, where it might even be that's all they know. That from their point of view, yoga is some kind of stretching practice, exercise practice, and that's it. And based on how, good morning, I've just started, based on how people are exposed to yoga in the modern day, well, that's hardly surprising. It's pretty much a physical practice. You do the postures. Somebody might bring in some breathing, somebody might bring in some chanting, somebody might talk a bit about the philosophy. But generally speaking, the entirety of the Hatha Yoga system is not really taught in a regular class, right? And you could say, well, that's appropriate on some levels, and maybe it's missing something as well. One of the reasons why I put together this practitioner course was because I felt even in a teacher training environment, you didn't necessarily get the opportunity to cover up all the aspects or all the tools required for an effective practice, mainly because a lot of times the students weren't ready. You actually needed quite a lot of experience to be exposed to certain things. And a lot of times it wasn't what they were looking for in the first place. So we have to qualify what the individual's desires or needs or what their perspectives are coming into a practice. This is what I expect it to be. And then there's the reality of what a Hatha Yoga practice from the traditional point of view actually is. And in my experience, a lot of times it requires or demands certain things from us that maybe we're not ready to address, whether that's lifestyle habits, whether that's a particular kind of viewpoint or perspective in terms of dropping certain conditions and patterns. A lot of times we just don't have the desire, the time or the energy to do the things that the ancient yogis would have done, because they would have spent a huge amount of time working on themselves, if not exclusively, right? So you think of the ashrams, the hermitage, the forest dwellings, the caves, they were sequestered for the most part from practically their whole lives. And so those of us who are what they would call householders in India, we don't have that time, and you might not even have the inclination. So, but I think it's my responsibility in this course to at least give you the components, and what you do with them are up to you. I have to try to give them to you in a safe manner, because obviously in this dynamic, there are certain things that we can't do because it's just not safe. I mean, I'm not going to start teaching you inversions when I can't even see half your body on the screen, you know, it's just not right. From my point of view, there are other maybe pranayamic practices that we can't do yet, because I need to be able to see you and see what your response to what's happening is. Hopefully that makes sense. And for those of you who are teachers, it's important to remember that whatever about this online explosion of yoga and other things, we have to keep in mind that there are certain things that need to be taught live, and they have always been taught that way, and for good reason. Yeah, you need to be able to see the response of the student to the activity, and you can't do that through a screen for the most part. Yeah, because sometimes some of you are like, you're 10, 15 feet away from your camera. I can't see your face. I mean, I can see your outline, but I can't see your response in your face. You could be smiling at me right now, or you could be frowning at me. I don't know. So when you're doing certain activities, you need to have that biofeedback loop happening. Hopefully that makes sense. So if we go back to these aspects, now these are not necessarily in chronological order. They are slightly in terms of, most people would begin with asana practice or posture practice, and you would possibly be ending with some kind of Laya absorption state. But you could suggest that you want to be absorbed from the very beginning. So from the very first posture, you want to be absorbed, right? So I'll go through them individually, and then hopefully we can tie them together and how these aspects work together as a practice. Yeah, we've already been working all of these aspects, some of them milder, some of them more intense than others, but ideally they're represented throughout an entire Hatha Yoga practice. So posture we know. So what does that mean posture-wise in terms of the purposes? For me, the purposes lie within 3 or 4 main qualities. So you want to be stimulating the blood, the bones, cleansing the organs. There needs to be a restorative quality. It's not just all dynamic. And probably most importantly, you need to stimulate the Agni, or the fire. Now, so that's bones, blood, some restorative quality, and the Agni, the fire. We can overstimulate the fire. So for example, I would not be a huge advocate of Hatha Yoga, or what was originally called Bikram Yoga, on a daily basis, all year round, indefinitely. A couple times a week, okay. Depending on the climate you're in, okay. Because the effect on the Agni can be detrimental in the long term. So if you're in a climate like Ireland, for example, or in the Northern Hemisphere, you in the winter, and you go into a hot yoga class in the evening, and it feels great because you're hot, your body's going to open up, and you're out of the cold, and you come back out, and that's fine. But you do that consistently over time, and I've seen this with people who have taught it for many years. The fire internally starts to die because it's getting the external temperature going, oh, I don't need to work. The room's really hot. I don't need to work. I'll let that do it for me. And so the internal structure starts to switch off. So that's the main reason why I feel it has to be put in its place and understood when to do it. If you look at where it came from, it was practiced in LA, predominantly in LA, in a climate that was, it's probably the most, I've lived there, it's probably the most consistent climate, one of the most consistent climates on the planet. Every single day is exactly the same temperature. So it's not going to affect the fire so much because you're going to go into a slightly warmer environment and then you come out to maybe a slightly cooler environment, and that's it. So there's very little difference or gradient between the two. Where if in a country like Ireland, you might be going into something massively high that you're actually never going to experience in this climate, and then you step out into a really, really cold climate, and there's a huge disparity between the temperatures. So internally that can have a not such a great effect in the long term. Hopefully that makes sense, yeah? So when you say stimulating Agni, it's not just about, oh great, Dave says go do hot yoga because it stimulates my fire. Yeah, you have to put everything into context, yeah? Particularly in the days of marketing and advertising, which we were born into, yeah? I mean, go back 100 years, it wasn't the case. People will do things because it's been marketed and advertised at them, and it looks good. It's been dolled up very nicely. It's been promoted very well, but they don't necessarily know how to put it in the context of the broader scope of where it comes from. Because lots of yoga these days is kind of cherry picked in terms of styles of practice or elements of practice that are focused on as a style of yoga by itself, and that might be fine. It might be very useful, but it might only be one component of many. And if you don't see the bigger picture, then you don't realize where that small element actually sits in the bigger picture, if that makes sense, yeah? So blood, bones, Agni, some kind of restorative quality. Now obviously, for example, there's a big move on restorative yoga these days. And that can have its own huge amount of benefits, of course, but there's also a certain preparation needed to really be able to have the qualities of restoration from these activities. It's not just a matter of throwing somebody over a bolster with little to no posture experience, doesn't really know their body, isn't coordinated, can't work with their breath, and then just throw them over a bolster and it'll be restorative. That's not going to work. And unfortunately, that can be the way it's promoted these days, because, everyone wants to be restored, of course, but you have to understand the context of where that came from. Restorative practices of yoga predominantly were propagated by Mr. Iyengar. He designed all the props that we now use and don't even think about where they came from. But for very specific reasons. The hormones, the hormonal system that was looking to be stimulated, the exact glands, for example, are you stimulating the thyroid specifically? Are you going to add the thyroid and the pineal gland and the pituitary gland? Are you looking to stimulate the thymus gland, etc., etc.? And so understanding the endocrine system is very important if you're teaching restorative yoga, or if you're using restorative yoga as a practice. You can do these things without the use of props and bolsters, for example. There can be restorative qualities to many different kinds of practices, even ones that look very dynamic or are in fact dynamic. There could be a restorative element to it if you know what you're doing, how to pay attention, how much attention, and how much effort to use, when to restrain yourself, etc. So there can be more components to it than simply just lying over a bolster. The other aspect that is important is to purely from it would start on the physiological level, but then it would move into the energetic level. So obviously most people in the West these days, they have stiff shoulders and stiff hips, right? So, or one or both. So we have to free the hips and the shoulders, first and foremost. Yeah, so that's a physiological quality, you might say. The activities you do maybe be focusing on opening the hips, focusing on opening the shoulders, but also putting that into context, because energetically they correspond to each other. So if you just focus on the hips without being aware of their connection to the shoulder girdle, then you're missing something. Yeah. So you can have workshops that are hip openers only, and you can have workshops just shoulder openers only. Well, you're missing a huge component there, because you're not recognizing that the hips and the shoulders energetically correspond to each other. So when you work one, you indirectly affect the other. So that should be brought into the context of the practice. That makes sense. Within opening the shoulder and the hip girdle, the design there is so that you free the spine. Because when you get to the latter stages of the Hatha Yoga practice, of course, it's all about seated meditation. So when you get into Laya, absorption, another word for Laya sometimes can be samadhi, you're dealing with dhyana and dharana. So you're dealing with concentration, first and foremost, and then some kind of contemplation or meditative state. Yeah. In order for us to move into those kind of states, the spine has to be free. If you're busy trying to free your spine up because you can't move, or you can't sit comfortably for a long period of time, then you're going to find the ability to absorb is decreased. Yeah. So freeing the spine, starting with the shoulders and the hips, freeing the waist and the groins. The waist and the groins are very important, because particularly in the Western and even in the Eastern now, because of the technology age, people sitting on a desk all day, the hips are tight, the shoulders are tight, neck. This affects the cervical. Most injuries these days people are getting are based around the neck and shoulders and the sacrum, yeah, because it's long hours sitting. So you free the hips and shoulders to free the spine, and to do that you have to include the groins and the waist, because they are what holds the spine and the pelvis in place for long periods of time. So they tend to be very tight, and then when they open, they free rotation in the spine, and they free a sense of movement in the spine. This also means that eventually there's a sense of coordinating your limbs, so that you can move your arms and your legs in a coordinated fashion. Not just, it can be very kind of linear, clunky. Eventually the limbs move together. Yeah, you can move the arms and legs in a very coordinated fashion in a 360-degree movement. So you can turn on yourself while each limb is doing something different. Any of those of you who've done any kind of classical dance or ballet, It's a very difficult thing to do. And the yoga is no different, because if you keep it linear, i.e. you just separate the arms, separate the legs, and one leg does one thing, and one leg does another, that's fine, but that's kind of a beginner practice, to be quite honest. The more advanced practice, I use that word loosely, is to coordinate movements. And why? Because it's about natural patterns of energy. Yeah? If you consider the movement that you're trying to release or establish is the movement of the vayus, so the winds in the body. Right? So those 72,000 nadis, those channels, of which we're mostly interested in 13, but they move, from the eyes down through the central channel to the big toes, from the ears down through the central to the big toes, from the center out to the hands, around the waist, down the sides, up the front, down the back. So they cover obviously the whole body, but they need to, in order to stimulate them, you have to be able to move the limbs in more of a sporadic movement, not just a linear, straight line kind of movement, because of course there are very few, if any, straight lines in nature. So, bones, blood, agni, restorative quality. Freeing the waist, the groins, in order to free the spine, after freeing the hips and shoulders, and then coordinating the limbs. So, regardless of what kinds of postures you do, those principles have to be applied or stimulated, in my opinion, in my experience. If you don't stimulate the bones, then you put too much stress on the joints, and you overtax or overdevelop the muscles. If you don't stimulate the fire tends to deplete, and your immune system tends to get weaker over time. If you don't bring in a sense of freeing the waist, the groins, and freeing the spine, then you rely very much on your dominant aspects. So some of us might be more flexible or more stronger in one area of the body than another. So you end up relying on those because you haven't freed the areas of blockage or obstruction. And in order to free some kind of life force, there has to be a more sporadic, a more natural pattern of movement, which is not limited to just the necessarily traditional yoga postures as I've come across, because I did traditional, and I might say maybe classical would be a more appropriate term, and sometimes they're interchanged, but classical would be, the poses that you're pretty much, most people would be very familiar with. And they're still there, and they're still incredibly useful, of course, but there might be different kinds of movements that free the body in a slightly different way, and that could be useful as well. That's why I explore different things in the martial art world, in the dance, like the Indian dance, for example, martial arts, natural patterns or movements of animals in the animal kingdom. Seeing a lot of the postures, whether it was from the Indian perspective, the Chinese, Taoist, even different parts of many different parts of the Southeast Asia and so on. Any of the movement arts very much were created from observing nature, observing all the animals. Yeah, seeing how they moved. How does a cat move? How does a monkey move? How does a small creature move, like an insect, versus something very large, and mimicking those movements and seeing how those patterns are. Because of course, if you go back to a DNA perspective, we're not that far removed from, for example, chimpanzees, and the percentage of difference in DNA from most mammals and most animals on the planet to the humans is tiny. We think we're completely different. We're not. We're not too many strands away from climbing up trees still. So I think that's all I want to say about the posture practice. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay, so obviously these all come together, so I'm talking about them separately, but just keep in mind, they all come together. So pranayama, obviously, you're not doing posture without breathing. Pranayama can be described in different ways, whether you want to talk about it as a breath control mechanism, whether it's a breath extending mechanism, or even a breath restraint. So restrain the yama means to restrain. So restraining the breath, restraining the life force. Of course, that brings in the three main aspects of the breath, which is, of course, puraka, or the inhalation. Rajaka, the exhalation, and Kumbhaka, the retention. And the retention can be either after the inhale or obviously after the exhale. So you have 3 components that turn into 4 if you consider the Kumbhaka has 2 aspects. They can be activated in the posture practice. So from the very beginning, you can say, okay, I'm going to inhale, pause, then I'm going to exhale, pause, then I'm going to inhale, pause, I'm going to exhale, pause, and so on. You can do that throughout the whole standing practice from the very first movement that you do, or you can bring it into a more formal seated position like a pranayama, etc., where you formally recognize those 4 aspects. So it can be done on both levels, and in my experience, it's important to bring in the Kumbhaka in particular in the physical posture practices, not necessarily as quickly as possible, but certainly not waiting until you feel, well, I'm now in a pranayama position and now I'll do the Kumbhaka. At that stage, it's you want the system to be accustomed to retention on some even small level. So that's why, for example, the Bandha, which is important to bring in the Kumbhaka, is the Uddiyana Bandha. So at the end of the exhale, drawing the navel back, holding that there, and then inhale. Yeah? And you can be doing that pretty much from the very first posture. Some things obviously are going to lend themselves better to it than others. Obviously forward bends and twists are going to accentuate the ability to retain the breath out, and certain postures like back bends, for example, are not. They're going to make it much harder for you to work the retention at the end of the exhale. However, they will probably stimulate the opposite. So when you inhale in a back bend, you have the opportunity to hold that inhale. Easier than if you were doing a forward bend. Hopefully that makes sense. So the breath control and restraint should really be introduced. You know, I'm talking at your level of practice. For beginners, of course, they're busy trying to figure out where their hands and feet are. So this is more related to an experienced practitioner. So it's more about how and when to stimulate the inhale versus the exhale. Do I need to hold the inhale right now as I move from one thing to the other? Do I accentuate the exhale as I move from one place to the other? So considering the use of the retention of either the inhale or the exhale in transition, not just while you're stable or static, but actually as you're transitioning from one position to the next. And that will make it easier for you to respond correctly to the retention when you're in a seated or stable or static position, if that makes sense. If you can do it when you're fluid and you're moving, it's going to be much more acceptable to your system to do it when you're seated.